It started with laughter until one question changed everything. Under bright studio lights, the interview felt easy, familiar, routine. But live TV can turn in an instant, and when Tom Holland sat down with Whoopi Goldberg to promote one of the world's biggest franchises, the conversation suddenly went somewhere no one saw coming. Because this wasn't just another interview. It became a moment where charm met pressure, where a global superstar found himself navigating a question that wasn't in the script, and where millions watching live could feel the shift in real time. Before we get into what happened next, make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below because moments like this don't just entertain, they reveal something deeper about the people we think we already know. Tom Holland had built a reputation that few young actors ever achieve. By the time he stepped onto that stage, he wasn't just another Hollywood name, he was Spider-Man. A role that came with global recognition, massive expectations, and a level of scrutiny that followed him everywhere. But beyond the suit, beyond the action scenes and blockbuster premieres, Holland had cultivated something equally powerful: relatability. He was the actor who laughed during interviews, who spoiled plot points accidentally, who danced on talk shows and leaned into the awkwardness rather than hiding from it. Audiences trusted him. And that's what made this moment different. Because when someone known for being open and lighthearted suddenly hesitates, even briefly, it stands out. Across from him sat Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran of live television, an Oscar-winning performer, a host who had seen decades of Hollywood evolution and wasn't afraid to ask questions that cut through the surface. Her style wasn't aggressive. It was direct, and often disarming. The show itself carried a certain expectation. Conversations could be playful, but they could also shift quickly into something more grounded. Topics that started light could turn serious without warning. That unpredictability was part of what made live television compelling. And on this particular day, everything seemed routine. The introduction was warm. Applause filled the studio. Holland smiled, waved, and settled into his seat with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. The early part of the conversation moved exactly as expected, discussing upcoming projects, the experience of being part of the Marvel Universe, and the overwhelming response from fans around the world. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt tense. But underneath that familiarity was a topic that had been quietly circulating in public conversations for years, something audiences were increasingly curious about but rarely heard addressed directly on live television. Not in the abstract sense. Not in industry terms. But specifically how much actors in massive franchises are actually paid and how that compares to the billions those films generate. It's the kind of topic that exists just beneath the surface of celebrity interviews. Everyone knows it's there, but it's rarely brought into the spotlight in real time. And that's where the dynamic begins to shift. Because live television doesn't offer the luxury of editing. There are no cuts, no retakes, no chance to reframe a moment once it's already happened. Every pause, every expression, every glance becomes part of the story. As the conversation continued, Whoopi Goldberg maintained her calm, steady presence. She listened closely, occasionally nodding, occasionally leaning forward, just slightly, small signals that she was preparing to guide the discussion somewhere more specific. Holland, still relaxed, responded with the same energy he was known for. His answers were thoughtful but light. He joked when appropriate. He kept the tone easy. But there's always a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when an interview begins to transition. It doesn't announce itself. It just happens. A shift in pacing. A slight pause before the next question. A change in tone that's almost imperceptible unless you're watching closely. And then, it arrives. Not as a confrontation. Not as an accusation. But as a question that lands differently than the ones before it. A question that moves away from promotion and into something more personal. More revealing. For a split second, the atmosphere changes. The audience doesn't fully react yet, but they feel it. And so does Tom Holland. Because even before he answers, there's a brief hesitation. Not long enough to disrupt the flow, but long enough to register. Long enough to suggest that this wasn't something rehearsed. That this wasn't part of the usual rhythm. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of the interview begins to evolve. What started as a standard promotional appearance is now something else entirely. Something unscripted. Something real. And as millions continue watching, the question hangs in the air, waiting for an answer that could either pass quietly or change the tone of the entire conversation. Because sometimes, it's not the question itself that matters most. It's how someone responds when they didn't see it coming. And what happened next is where everything truly shifted. By the time Tom Holland walked onto that stage, The image was already set. To the public, he wasn't just an actor, he was the face of a new generation of blockbuster cinema. Young, energetic, and deeply tied to one of the most powerful entertainment machines in the world. His journey from a relatively unknown performer to Spider-Man had been well documented, celebrated, and, in many ways, idealized. But behind that image was something more complex. Because the Marvel Cinematic Universe wasn't just a creative phenomenon, it was a business model. A system that had redefined how Hollywood operated, turning individual films into interconnected events and actors into long-term investments. And with that came a question that had quietly followed every major star in the franchise. What are they really being paid? It wasn't a new conversation. For years, audiences had speculated about salaries within major film franchises. Reports would surface, numbers would circulate, comparisons would be drawn. Some actors were said to earn tens of millions per film, especially those who had been part of the franchise since its early days. But newer actors, especially those stepping into iconic roles, were often in a different position. Their contracts were structured differently. Their leverage was different. And their value, while enormous on screen, wasn't always reflected in the same way financially, at least not at the beginning. Tom Holland entered the Marvel Universe at a time when the system was already fully established. He wasn't building the foundation, he was stepping into something that was already dominating global box offices. That distinction mattered, because while audiences saw Spider-Man as central to the story, the business side of Hollywood often operated on timelines and negotiations that didn't always align with public perception. Holland himself had spoken in the past about his excitement for the role, about the pressure, about the responsibility of taking on a character that had been portrayed by others before him. But when it came to finances, like most actors, he remained careful, measured, respectful of the industry's unspoken rules. Publicly, he focused on the work, the films, the fans, and for the most part, that approach worked. Interviews stayed light, conversations stayed centered on storytelling, and the more complicated aspects of the industry remained in the background. But outside of those interviews, the conversation continued. Articles comparing actor salaries, discussions about profit sharing, debates about how much studios earn versus how much performers receive. It wasn't controversy, it was curiosity. And curiosity has a way of building over time, especially when the numbers involved are as large as they are in franchises like Marvel. By the time Holland appeared on live television that day, the broader context was already in place. The audience didn't need a full explanation, they were aware, at least generally, of how massive these films were. Billions in global revenue, endless merchandising, cultural impact that extended far beyond the screen. And at the center of it, actors like Tom Holland, whose performances brought those stories to life. So when the topic of Marvel came up during the interview, it wasn't just about entertainment, it carried all of that context with it. Every mention of the films wasn't just about acting. It was about scale, about influence, about value. And that's what made the moment so delicate. Because asking about pay in that environment isn't just a financial question, it's a question about worth. About how the industry assigns value to individuals within a system that generates enormous profit. And live television is one of the few places where that kind of question can surface without warning. Whoopi Goldberg, with decades of experience, understood that balance. She knew how to navigate conversations that others might avoid. She didn't push recklessly, but she didn't shy away either. Her approach often relied on timing, on reading the room, on knowing when a conversation could move deeper without breaking entirely. And as the interview progressed, the groundwork was quietly being laid. The earlier questions had established comfort. They had reinforced Holland's public image: charming, open, cooperative. The audience was engaged, relaxed, enjoying the exchange, which made what came next even more impactful. Because tension on live television rarely comes from conflict alone. It comes from contrast, from the difference between what the audience expects and what actually happens. And in this case, the expectation was clear. A promotional interview, a continuation of the familiar. But beneath that expectation was a growing awareness both in the studio and among viewers that the conversation might not stay there. There were small, subtle cues that something was shifting. A slightly longer pause between questions. A change in tone that leaned just a bit more serious. The kind of shift that isn't obvious in isolation, but becomes clear in hindsight. Holland, to his credit, maintained his composure. He continued to engage, to respond thoughtfully, to keep the energy consistent. But even within that consistency, there was an awareness. Because experienced performers understand live television. They understand that not every question can be anticipated, and that sometimes the most important moments are the ones you don't prepare for. The audience, meanwhile, remained attentive, uncertain, perhaps, but still within the comfort of the show's rhythm. They hadn't yet seen the full turn. They hadn't yet heard the question that would define the segment. But they were close, very close, because the conversation had reached a point where moving forward meant either staying safe or stepping into something more revealing. And Whoopi Goldberg, with a calm expression and steady voice, chose that moment to ask the question that shifted everything. Not loudly, not aggressively, but directly. A question that cut through the usual boundaries of celebrity interviews. A question about Marvel, about money, about what it really means to be at the center of something so massive. And as the words left her mouth, the studio didn't erupt. There was no immediate reaction, just a brief, almost imperceptible pause. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone realizes, at the same time, that something unexpected has just been said. And in that silence, all attention turned to Tom Holland. Waiting, watching, because in live television, there's no script to fall back on, only the moment, and how you choose to respond to it. The question didn't echo, but it lingered. For a fraction of a second, the studio held its breath. Not in shock, not in discomfort, at least not yet, but in recognition. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it at the same time. The rhythm that had carried the interview forward so smoothly was gone, replaced by a stillness that only live television can create. Tom Holland heard the question clearly. Whoopi Goldberg hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't framed it dramatically. She simply asked directly, calmly, about Marvel pay, about what someone in his position actually earns while being at the center of a franchise that generates billions. It wasn't phrased as an accusation. It wasn't even framed as criticism. But it was specific enough, personal enough, that it couldn't be answered casually. And that's where the moment began. Holland's expression didn't change immediately. At first glance, it looked like he was still processing the conversation as it had been. His posture remained upright, shoulders relaxed, hands loosely positioned. But then came a subtle shift. A blink that lasted just slightly longer than the ones before. A small inhale. A pause. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious unless you were paying close attention. But in live television, those micromoments carry weight, because they reveal what words haven't yet had time to shape. The audience remained quiet. There was no laughter, no interruption, just an attentive silence that allowed every second to stretch a little further. Whoopi Goldberg didn't rush to fill it. She waited. That, in itself, was significant. Experienced hosts understand the power of silence. They know that stepping in too quickly can soften a moment that's still forming. And here, she allowed the pause to exist to give the question space to land fully. Holland's eyes shifted briefly, not away, but slightly to the side, as if organizing his thoughts. It wasn't avoidance. It was calculation. The kind that happens when someone is choosing their words carefully in real time. Because this wasn't just a private conversation. It was live, unedited, broadcast to millions. And every word carried consequence, not just for him, but for the system he was part of. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Careful. He didn't jump straight into numbers. He didn't confirm or deny specifics. Instead, he began by framing his experience, speaking about gratitude, about the opportunity to be part of something as significant as the Marvel Universe. It was a familiar approach, one that actors often use when navigating sensitive topics. But even within that familiarity, there was a difference. Because the question hadn't been general, it had been direct. And the response, while composed, didn't fully move away from that tension. As he continued, Holland acknowledged the scale of the films, the success, the global reach. He spoke about how fortunate he felt to be involved, how the experience had changed his life, his career. His words were steady, controlled. But the pause from earlier hadn't disappeared, it lingered beneath the surface of every sentence. The audience listened closely. Some nodded. Some remained still. There was no clear emotional cue to follow, no signal that the moment had passed or resolved. Because it hadn't, Whoopi Goldberg, still composed, leaned slightly forward, not interrupting, but engaged. Her expression remained neutral, attentive. She wasn't challenging his answer, but she wasn't redirecting the conversation either. She let it continue. And that choice kept the tension intact. Holland, aware of the space he was in, continued to navigate carefully. He avoided specifics, instead focusing on the broader picture, on the collaborative nature of filmmaking, on the teams involved, on the idea that success wasn't individual, but shared. It was a thoughtful answer, strategic, and in many ways, effective. But what made the moment stand out wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The pacing, the slight hesitation before certain phrases, the careful balance between honesty and discretion. Because even without explicit detail, the audience could sense what was happening. This wasn't a rehearsed answer. This was real-time navigation. Live. Unfiltered. And that's what gave the moment its weight. For a brief second, as Holland finished one part of his response, there was another pause. Shorter this time, but noticeable. The kind of pause that invites either closure or continuation. Whoopi Goldberg chose not to push further. She nodded, acknowledged the response, and gently guided the conversation forward. But even as the topic shifted, the energy in the room didn't fully return to what it had been. Something had changed. The lightness from earlier was still there, but now it coexisted with something else. An awareness. A recognition that the conversation had crossed into territory that isn't often explored so openly on live television. The audience responded with polite applause. Measured. Respectful. Not overly enthusiastic, but not uncomfortable either. Just enough to signal that the moment had been received. And then, almost seamlessly, the show moved on. New questions. New topics. A return to the familiar structure of daytime television. But for those who had been watching closely, the shift remained. Because moments like that don't disappear just because the conversation continues. They linger. In expressions. In memory. In the subtle understanding that, for a few minutes, the boundaries of a typical celebrity interview had been pushed just a little further. And Tom Holland, known for his ease, his humor, his openness, had faced a question that required something different. Restraint. Precision. Control. Not a breakdown. Not a confrontation in the traditional sense. But a quiet, unmistakable moment where the unexpected became real and everyone watching could feel it. And as the segment continued, the question was no longer being asked out loud. But it was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be interpreted long after the cameras moved on. The applause faded quickly. Not abruptly but noticeably. It didn't carry the same energy as earlier moments in the interview. It was respectful, measured, almost careful, as if the audience understood that something subtle but significant had just taken place. Tom Holland smiled again. Not forced, not artificial, but slightly more contained than before. The kind of smile that signals professionalism, that keeps the moment moving forward without drawing attention back to what just happened. Whoopi Goldberg mirrored that energy. She didn't revisit the question. She didn't emphasize it or attempt to extract more. Instead, she transitioned smoothly, guiding the conversation back into safer territory, upcoming projects, lighter anecdotes, moments that would restore the rhythm the audience was used to. And on the surface, it worked. The show continued. The structure held. But underneath that structure, the shift remained. Because live television doesn't reset instantly. It carries memory. Even as new topics are introduced, what just happened lingers in tone, in pacing, in the way both host and guest subtly adjust. Holland remained engaged. He answered each question with clarity, returning to the charm that had defined him throughout his career. He laughed when appropriate, responded thoughtfully, and maintained the professionalism expected of someone in his position. But there was a difference. Small, almost imperceptible but real. His responses became slightly more measured. His pauses slightly more deliberate. The spontaneity that had defined the earlier part of the interview was still present, but now it was balanced with a heightened awareness. Not discomfort. Not withdrawal. Just control. The kind that comes after navigating an unexpected moment in real time. The audience, too, adjusted. Laughter returned, but it came a second later than before. Applause followed, but with a touch more restraint. It wasn't that the energy was gone, it was that it had changed. Because once a conversation crosses a certain line into something more personal, more revealing, it doesn't fully go back. And that's what made this moment stand out. Not because it escalated. Not because it turned confrontational. But because it didn't. It remained calm, composed, professional, and yet undeniably different. As the segment came to an end, the closing remarks were brief. Gratitude was exchanged. The audience applauded once more, this time with a little more confidence, as if the structure of the show had finally settled back into place. Holland stood, waved, and exited with the same poise he had entered. And just like that, the live moment was over. But the conversation wasn't. Because in the hours that followed, the clip began to circulate. Not as a headline-grabbing controversy, not as a scandal, but as a moment. A moment where a simple question shifted the tone of a live interview. Online discussions focused on the pause, on the delivery, on the way Holland chose his words rather than the words themselves. Some viewers saw it as a fair question, one that reflected a broader curiosity about how the entertainment industry operates. Others focused on Holland's response, noting how carefully he navigated a topic that many public figures tend to avoid. There were no extreme reactions, no polarized debates, just analysis, observation, and a shared recognition that something genuine had unfolded without being forced. Media coverage followed a similar pattern. The moment was referenced, replayed, discussed not as a controversy, but as an example of how live television can still produce unscripted, authentic interactions. In an era where interviews are often tightly controlled, heavily edited, and carefully managed, this stood out for a different reason. It felt real, unplanned, and that authenticity carried weight. For Tom Holland, the long-term impact wasn't defined by backlash or criticism. If anything, it reinforced something audiences already believed about him, that he was capable of handling pressure with composure, that he could navigate unexpected situations without losing control of the moment, and perhaps most importantly, that he understood the balance required in his position. Because being part of a global franchise isn't just about performance, it's about representation. Every answer, every appearance, every public interaction contributes to a larger narrative. And in that moment, Holland maintained that narrative. Carefully, deliberately, without creating conflict. Whoopi Goldberg, on the other hand, demonstrated something equally important. The role of a host isn't just to entertain, it's to ask questions that matter, even when they are uncomfortable. But timing is everything. And knowing when to ask and when to move on is what defines experience. She didn't push the moment beyond its natural limit. She allowed it to exist, to breathe, and then she let it pass. That restraint ensured that the moment remained impactful without becoming disruptive. And that balance is what made the exchange memorable. Not explosive, not dramatic in the traditional sense, but quietly significant, because it highlighted something that often goes unnoticed. The power of a single question. Not one designed to provoke outrage. Not one meant to create headlines, but one that simply steps outside the expected script and invites a real response. Today, the moment still circulates not because it shocked the world, but because it captured something rare. Authenticity. A glimpse into how public figures respond when the conversation shifts unexpectedly. A reminder that even in the most controlled environments, unpredictability still exists. And that sometimes, the most revealing moments are the ones that happen without warning. For viewers, it remains a subtle but compelling example of how live television continues to evolve. For the industry, it reflects the ongoing curiosity about transparency, about how stories are told and who gets to tell them. And for Tom Holland, it stands as a quiet testament to professionalism under pressure. No confrontation, no conflict, just a moment where everything slowed down, and the world watched how he handled it. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes, the most important stories aren't the loudest ones, they're the ones that unfold in silence, one question at a time.